Though no written proof exists before the 16th century, it is widely accepted that Uisce Beatha originated in Ireland towards the end of the first millennium. It is said that the Normans encountered this fiery spirit when invading Ireland during the 12th century, and that it was they who anglicised Uisce Beatha to whisky. By the 17th century, whisky making was commonplace. In rural areas, most people distilled their own, while at the same time there was at least one distillery in each large town. For some, Christmas Day 1661 marks the beginning of the long history of illicit distillation in Ireland. Taxation on alcohol was introduced by the British government on that date, and it applied to Ireland shortly afterwards. Others trace the origins of illicit distillation to 1760, which was when private distillation was outlawed. Distillers had to obtain a license, and this, the government hoped, would make it easier for their excise men, or gaugers, to collect the tax. Whether it all began in 1661 or 1760, Poitin, as the illicit whisky became known, has been with us ever since. The process of poitin making, however, was updated in the latter half of the 20th century. Modern distillers no longer use the kiln, ruins of which are now the only visible pointers to the traditional craft of poitin making in Connemara on Ireland's west coast. Many ingredients have been used to make poitin down the years, including, apparently, molasses, sugar beet, treacle, rice and potatoes. But poitin, like all whiskies, was traditionally distilled from grain, usually barley. The first stage in traditional poitin making was to steep the barley in a lake, a river or a bog hole. 200 weight or 16 stone of barley would normally yield between 5 and 6 gallons of poitin, and that was the smallest amount of barley steeped at a time. 2 stone of oats, for use at a later stage, was steeped with every 200 weight of barley. The sacks of barley and oats were allowed to soak for a night and a day before being removed and left to drain overnight. On being removed from the water, the barley and oats soon began to germinate. During germination, or malting, the starch in the barley was converted to sugar, which in turn was converted to alcohol at a later stage. As soon as the grain was sprouted, the sacks of malting barley and oats were spilt out separately onto a clean floor and then spread evenly across the floor. The malting barley was left sprouting for at least 8 days. To ensure each grain sprouted evenly, the barley and oats were turned each evening. Then, in order to stop germination, the oats and malted barley or malt had to be dried in a kiln. From the very outset, the tax on alcohol had been a source of great resentment in Ireland, where it was seen by many as yet another imposition of British rule. In spite of this, the tax was increased during the late 1700s. While the British sought every means of enforcing collection, those who made whisky sought every means of evading the tax, or at least reducing the amount they paid. In rural Ireland, where most people could not afford to buy legally produced or Parliament whisky, distillers simply set up their stills in remote places and made poitín both for themselves and for sale to their neighbours. Legal distillers, who had to be seen to comply with the law, either hid some of their whisky and sold it on the quiet, or failed to declare up to half of their output and then bribed corrupt excise officers. Instead of reducing taxes, the British government responded by employing more manpower to try to end illicit distilling and to keep a closer eye on legal whisky distillers. Legal distillers were also subjected to tighter and more impractical legislation. This culminated in legal distillers being taxed not on the amount of whisky they actually produced, but on the amount they could theoretically produce given the capacity of their stills. Before the new regulations were enforced, legal distillers employing vast copper pot stills could generally withstand competition from the poitín makers as their businesses were bigger and because they could also market their whisky further afield. When the law was changed, many legal distillers installed shallow, small-capacity stills on which they paid less tax and in which they could rapidly distill whisky. The stills were then worked around the clock to meet the demand. As a result, the quality of most legally produced whisky declined, and demand fell sharply, with most people switching to poitín, which was generally far superior in quality and less expensive to buy. In the decades following the Distilling Act of 1779, poitín making became more popular than it had ever been, while at the same time hundreds of legal distilleries were forced to close. To stop germination and in preparation for milling, the malted barley and oats had to be dried in a kiln. The kiln was a circle of stout wall, measuring about 8 feet across and 5 feet in height. This unusual kiln was built between two large boulders. Firstly, the poitín makers would place a thick layer of strong, clean straw on a suspended wooden floor situated halfway between the roof and the kiln floor. A covering, sewn together from canvas bags, was laid on top of the straw. The malted barley and oats were then spread out evenly on top of the canvas covering. The malt was kept to one side of the kiln, the oats to the other. Next, a turf fire was lit outside the kiln next to the kiln flue. The heat and smoke from the turf fire was drawn inside by the kiln flue and up through the straw and canvas covering to the malt and oats above. This gave traditional poitín its peaty taste and aroma. From time to time, the poitín makers had to brave the smoke and intense heat inside the kiln. The malted barley and oats had to be turned over regularly to ensure each grain would dry properly. With a favourable wind, it would take about 8 hours to dry 200 weight of barley and 2 stone of oats. After drying the malted barley and oats in a kiln, each in turn was ground to a fine meal in preparation for the brewing stage. Millstones were usually made of greenstone and weighed in at about 100 weight each. An engraving tool called a brakere was used to dress the millstones. When the millstones were assembled, the iron spigot protruding from the lower stone slotted neatly into a wooden piece fitted inside the upper stone. This allowed the upper stone to rotate. Leather hoops placed around the iron spigot and between the stones made it easier to turn the upper millstone, and also determined how fine the meal would be ground. When milling, the poitin makers wore no shoes, so as not to contaminate the ground meal or grist. A cloth was sometimes spread on the floor next to the millstones to keep the grist clean and to make it easier to collect once milling had finished. A brush was normally used. Working on their own, it took the poitin makers about 10 hours to mill 200 weight of barley. The grist was then collected and stored until it was time to brew the ale. It took a further hour to mill the 2 stone of oats. With the introduction of new legislation, which made it unviable for most legal distillers to make good whiskey, the number of illicit distillers increased greatly, peaking during the early 1800s. While poitin making was largely restricted to Connaught and West Ulster by then, the illicit whiskey itself was being distributed throughout the land and was even being sold abroad. More resources went into suppressing the trade, but as poitin making and smuggling had become for many in these remote regions their only means of survival, any attempt by excise men or gaugers to end these practices was fiercely resisted. Gaugers were often attacked, even when they were accompanied by soldiers. Some were killed in the exchanges. Others were abducted to prevent them from giving evidence in court. As the gaugers were floundering in their attempts to counteract the rise in illicit distilling, the communal fine system was brought in. Its introduction in 1783 was an attempt at forcing landlords to lend their support to ending illicit distilling. Many landlords had profited indirectly from poitin making and had therefore been reluctant to see it end. The communal fine system meant any townland or parish where gaugers seized illicit distilling equipment was subjected to a heavy fine of which everyone had to pay a share. While some landlords paid the fine and subsequently increased rents, in most cases, gaugers were forced to seize property. In any event, the communal fine system caused a great deal of distress. Like the landlords, not all Protestant ministers were opposed to poitin making. Many had profited indirectly from illicit distilling through the payment of tithes, a tax which was paid to the local minister. Communal fines left most people unable to pay the tithes, which left many ministers on lower incomes. As a result, some ministers came out in support of illicit distilling. They said that many gaugers were guilty of cruelty and corruption, while the poitin makers' actions were justified by the fact that the lands on which they lived were incapable of supporting any other livelihood. Given that many Protestant ministers and landlords tolerated illicit distilling, the government came to realize that the only way to deal effectively with the illicit trade was by improving the laws governing distilling. The Excise Act, which they introduced in 1823, did away with many of the impracticalities of earlier acts. Following the Act, duty was assessed on the actual amount of spirit and on the strength of the spirit produced in a distillery. The tax on alcohol was also halved, making it viable once more for legal distillers to produce good quality whiskey. They could now compete with the poitin makers. The golden age of poitin making had come to an end, while legally produced Irish whiskey would soon enjoy a golden age of its own. After milling, the brewing stage came next. 200 weight of barley would normally yield between 40 and 60 gallons. As soon as the water in the pot had boiled, it was emptied into the large wooden vat and left to cool. Before the grist could be added to the water had to be of a certain warmth. Experience alone guided the poitin makers when determining the correct temperature. If the water wasn't hot enough when the grist was added, it wouldn't soften the grist sufficiently. Too hot, and it would turn the grist to porridge. Once the grist and the warm water had been thoroughly mixed, it was left to settle for about half an hour, in which time the sugars in the grist were dissolved. A sieve made of osier, hazel or heather, was then placed inside the vat at the outlet to keep the grain inside when the sugar-rich wort was drawn off. What was left at the bottom of the vat when the wort had been drawn off was called draff and was fed to milch cows. Wort itself was highly regarded as a purgative and was also given to cattle. When all of the wort had been drawn off, yeast was added to the barrels. First, some yeast was dissolved in a bucket containing some lukewarm wort. The mixture was poured into a wooden vessel where, after a while, it began to ferment. In this way, when the mixture was poured into the barrels, it would start a chain reaction, and soon all the lukewarm wort in the barrels was fermenting. The barrels were never filled to the brim when the yeast was being added, otherwise they would overflow during the violent fermentation which followed. After adding the yeast to the barrels, back, which helped seal the mixture, was added. Back was made by mixing ground oats in some warm water. When the back was made, the wooden vat was emptied and the mixture removed to the barrels. On being added to the barrels, the back rose to the top and formed an airtight seal which allowed the wort to ferment properly. Fermentation, or the conversion of sugar to alcohol, continued for 3 days, until the yeast was dead. The fermented liquid, or ale, was now ready for distillation. When the sugars in the wort had been converted to alcohol, the back fell spontaneously. The fermented liquid, or ale, was now ready for distillation. The ale, except for what was at the bottom of the barrels, was removed to the still house, which was what the Poitin makers called the spot where distilling took place. Poitin was traditionally distilled out of doors on commonage. In that way, if the authorities arrived in the vicinity, the Poitin makers could flee without fear of prosecution. The still consisted of a 40-gallon copper pot, a wooden cap which was placed on top, the arum, made from copper, which was inserted between the cap and the arum pipe, which was fixed to the worm, a coil of copper tubing, which was placed inside a wooden vat. After the still had been assembled, all of the various joints were sealed with a paste called gluten. Gluten was made from oatmeal, flour and water, and on drying it helped to prevent any alcohol escaping from the cap, the arum or the worm. In some areas the cap was filled with water. This also helped prevent any alcohol from escaping during distillation. Alcohol evaporates at a lower temperature than water. As soon as the temperature of the ale, which was mostly water, reached the boiling point of alcohol, the alcohol began to evaporate, leaving the water behind. The alcohol vapours passed through the cap and arum into the worm, where it condensed due to the cold water in the vat. What emerged from the tail of the worm was called singling. Singling had to be distilled once more to produce doubling and ultimately Poitin. Occasionally a check was carried out to see if any alcohol was escaping from the still. On contact with the flame, the alcohol ignited, which revealed the location of a leak. More gluten was used to fix the problem. Only the driest turf was used in Poitin making. If the turf was damp, it would smoulder, and the plume of smoke rising into the sky would give away the location of the stillhouse. As the warm alcohol vapours condensed into singling in the worm, the water in the vat would heat up. When the water was too hot, it had to be replaced with some cold water. If this wasn't done, the rate at which the alcohol vapours condensed into singling would slow down and ultimately damage the Poitin. It would take about 4 hours to distill the singling from a full barrel of ale. Singling could continue as long as the liquid ignited when thrown on the fire, and this test was carried out regularly towards the end of a run. When the distillate failed to ignite, little or no alcohol was being distilled, and so the run was ended. The liquid which failed to ignite was called faints. If too much faints was allowed through, it would ultimately affect the quality and strength of the poitin. A barrel of ale yielded 4 to 5 gallons of singling. The singling was safely stored away until the poitin makers had finished with each barrel and were ready to begin the doubling. What was left in the pot was called burm beer and was given to cattle or taken as medicine. While improvements in the law may have initiated a decline in poitin making, that decline hastened due to a variety of other factors. In response to what appeared to be a phenomenal rise in the consumption of alcohol, many temperance societies were formed during the early part of the 19th century. As a result of their work, alcohol consumption fell dramatically in the decades that followed, forcing many legal and illicit distillers out of work. Successive famines, culminating in the Great Famine of 1846, hit the western seaboard counties of Ireland hardest of all. As a result, illicit distilling, which had largely been confined to remote regions along the west coast, declined significantly. As the century wore on, people developed a taste for porter. Legal distillers were largely unaffected as they were selling more and more of their whiskey abroad. However, many poitin makers ceased distilling as porter became increasingly popular. Successive bad harvests during the late 1870s, combined with a sharp fall in the price of grain, meant bankruptcy, starvation and eviction for many small tenant farmers and their families. Illicit distilling saved many of these people from ruin. In 1879, the Land League was formed with the aims of achieving fair rent, free sale and fixity of tenure for small tenant farmers. In a little over 5 years, the Land League had achieved their aims, winning for small tenant farmers the opportunity to own their own land. It meant it was no longer necessary for many to distill poitin. From the mid to late 19th century, legal distillers were enjoying a boom period. They built bigger distilleries and were soon selling their malt and pot still whiskies throughout the British Empire and the US. The Industrial Revolution and the repeal of the Corn Laws in 1848, which allowed the importation of inexpensive North American grain, had made this possible. By the end of the century, the industry was in decline once more. The decline hastened during the early 20th century. The decline was initiated by the fact that many Irish distillers chose to ignore the increasing popularity of blended Scotch whisky, which they believed was inferior to the traditional malt and pot still whiskies. The decline hastened due to prohibition in the US, Irish independence at home, and the subsequent trade war with Britain, and also due to steep rises in duty during the 1920s. The decline and near demise of the Irish whisky industry and the government's propensity to increase taxes down through the years ensured poitin would continue to be made and consumed in Connemara and other disadvantaged areas, despite frequent attacks by the Catholic Church, and a greater regard generally for law and order.
Oh, let the grasses grow and the waters flow in a free and easy way. But give me enough of the rare old stuff that's made near Galway Bay. Come gougers all from Donegal, Sligo and Leitrim too. And we'll give them the slip and we'll take a sip of the rail of Mountain Dew. Skiddy idle little dum, skiddy idle little dum, skiddy idle little dum day. Skiddy idle little dum, skiddy idle little dum, skiddy idle little dum day. There's a night little still at the foot of the hill where the smoke curls up in the sky. Be a whiff of the smell, you can plainly tell that there's poitin boys close by. Where it fills the air with a perfume rare to betwixt both me and you. As home we roll, we'll drink a bowl or a bucket full of Mountain Dew. Skiddy idle little dum, skiddy idle little dum, skiddy idle little dum day. Skiddy idle little dum, skiddy idle little dum, skiddy idle little dum day.
There's learned men, this year's the plan, have written your prizes high. The sweet poitin from Ireland drain, the slate from Wade and Rye. Go away with your pose, the cure all is for pagan, Christian or Jew. Take off your coat and grace your throat with a bucket full of Mountain Dew.
Skiddy idle little dum, skiddy idle little dum, skiddy idle little dum day. Skiddy idle little dum, skiddy idle little dum, skiddy idle little dum day.
Once the singling had ended, the second distillation or doubling could begin. The still was dismantled and the pot emptied of the worm beer and cleaned. The singling was then poured into the pot, the cap and arm replaced, and the various joints resealed with lutein. Soon the doubling, or undiluted poitin, emerged from the worm. The first of the doubling was called the pure drop and was extremely potent. The poitin makers would set aside roughly a pint of the pure drop because many people believed in its healing powers. The pure drop, it was said, brought relief to those who suffered from arthritis when it was rubbed into the joints. When diluted with water, it was used to clean wounds. The poitin makers would set aside not more than a pint of the pure drop. Taking more might leave the finished product below strength. It would take about 5 hours to distill 5 to 6 gallons of doubling from 10 gallons of singling. Doubling could continue as long as the distillate ignited when thrown on the fire. And toward the end of the second run, this test would be carried out at regular intervals. When the distillate failed to ignite, the poitin makers ended the doubling. Though the poitin makers didn't allow any feints through with the doubling, they would, however, collect some. This they would use while proofing, the final step in poitin making. Once the doubling had finished, the still was dismantled. To prevent them from falling into the wrong hands, the pot and the worm were hidden underground or underwater. There they'd remain hidden until the poitin makers were ready to make another turn. Doubling had to be watered down to become poitin. The poitin makers had to be careful, however, not to add too much water. First they would fill a jug with doubling. A glass of feints or water was then added and the glass refilled. By observing how the bubbles in the glass behaved, the poitin makers could tell how strong or what proof the spirit was. They'd continue adding feints or water to the jug and refilling the glass until they had obtained the correct proof. When the poitin was of the correct proof, the bubbles formed a coat on top of the spirit. By keeping a count of how many glasses they had added to the jug, the poitin makers would know roughly how much fresh, clean water to add to the doubling in the keg to make poitin. At one time, a shebeen, where alcohol was sold illegally, could be found in almost every village, and shebeen owners were among the poitin makers' best customers. They also sold their poitin to local folk planning christenings, weddings or wakes. Until the poitin makers had found a buyer for their whisky, the ceramic jars or wooden kegs used to hold the poitin were hidden underground. In the latter half of the 20th century, the craft of poitin making was modernized. Discarded oil drums were used instead of the old copper pot and wooden vat, reducing costs. Sugar was added to the ale and the Burm beer redistilled, increasing yields. Kilns and millstones were no longer used, which saved time. Gas fires did away with turf, which meant poitin could now be distilled almost anywhere. Though the illicit whisky itself remained relatively the same, it had for many lost much of its character. Worse was to follow. Due to the ease with which modern poitin could be made, the number of illicit distillers increased once more. Some, however, were only interested in making money and cared little for the quality of their whisky. While poitin is still made in Connemara and elsewhere, the care that was once taken is not in evidence anymore. Modern distillers are contributing to the demise of this ancient craft, which must gladden the hearts of its critics, the medical profession, the authorities, and the Catholic Church.